Welcome. My name is Erin Connors, Director of Communications for the Fowler Museum at UCLA, filling in for our Curator of Public Programs, Bianca Collins. Thank you for joining us today, or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. The Fowler is honored to present today's program about an Inka Khipu as part of our Lunch and Learn series, which offers easily digestible explorations of charismatic objects from around the world. We're so pleased you've joined us to chew on some sustenance and feed your mind and soul. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Alba Menéndez Pereda, PhD candidate at Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA, for a program inspired by a Peruvian Inka Khipu on display at the Fowler in Communication Systems in a Global Context, currently on view through June 26th. Alba Menéndez Pereda is a PhD candidate at Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. Her research focuses on the commemorative practices of the Inka elites and the construction of Inka history through performances across the natural and built environment. Prior to her arrival in Los Angeles, Menéndez Pereda earned her bachelor's degree in Durham University in the UK and completed her master's at the University of Cambridge. At UCLA, she serves on the Fowler Museum Student Council and co-organizes the Andean Working Group, which brings together scholars working on the Andes from multiple disciplinary perspectives and shares information about the Andes with the public via social media. Before we get going, I have a few quick technical bits of housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click View Options and then go to side-by-side mode, so the video feed doesn't cover any of the screen sharing. If you have questions during our program, please submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote entries that you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. All right, that's all from me. Over to you, Alba.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start sharing my screen. Okay, perfect. So thank you for the introduction, Erin, and thank you to the Fowler Museum for giving me the opportunity to talk about Khipus and their legacy with everyone who has joined us today. So let's start from the beginning. What is a Khipu? On the screen, you can see a Khipu held by the Fowler Museum and in view in the Communication Systems in Global Context exhibition. Made of cotton, it dates to the Inca Empire, which developed in the Andes in South America between the 1440s and 1532. The Khipu can be understood as a three-dimensional textile used by the Incas to record information. Although the Incas did not have a written alphabet, they had a communication system based around strings and notes that was read through sight and touch. The term Khipu comes from Quechua, one of the languages spoken in the Inca Empire and still spoken today by indigenous people in the Andes. Khipu means knot in English and nudo in Spanish, alluding to the notes visible on the strings. You may see the term Khipu spelled with KH following a more Quechua spelling, or written using QU following a more Spanish spelling. Although Inka Khipus are perhaps the best known today, Khipus were not invented by the Incas. The earliest Khipus known today are associated with the Wari Empire, a civilization that developed in what is today Peru between the 7th and 11th centuries. Wari Khipus are known to have been either horizontal, as the one seen on the screen, or loop Khipus. They can be easily recognized by the wrapping of some of its cords using camelid fiber dyed with vibrant colors. Some scholars have argued that in the case of Wari Khipus, information was not encoded in notes, as it was the case in the Inka Khipus, but in the wrapping itself. Likely motivated by the need to control a great number of people across a vast territory that included mountain ranges, desertic coast, and jungles, the Inca adopted this earlier technology for its own administrative and communicative needs. Khipus were made using predominantly cotton or camelid fiber from llamas, alpacas, or their wilder relatives, guanacos and vicuñas, respectively. They might have also combined vegetal and animal fibers in a single Khipu. Most Inca Khipus that survive to this day within museum and private collections are made using cotton. This is about 85% of the approximately 1,400 extant Khipus that exist today. The raw materials were gathered, cleaned, spun, plied, and finally dyed using natural pigments coming from mineral, vegetal, or animal sources. The basic structure of an Inka Khipu includes a main, thick, horizontal primary cord which is to be read from the left to the right. From the main chord, pendant strings ranging from a few to over 1,000 hang in the vertical direction. Pendants may have subsidiary chords, which at the same time can also have their own subsidiaries. Scholars have argued that the top chords, visible in certain quipus, arranged oriented in the opposite direction from the pendants, record the arithmetic sum of the total values encoded in the notes of the pendants through which they pass, providing something similar to an overview of the information encoded in said pendants. A knot or ball of wool at the end of the main chord indicates the end of the register. On the other hand, the beginning section of the main chord, known as dangle or tail, was used to wrap the roll quipu for storage and transportation. An example of a large Inka Khipu, which has never been unrolled, can be found at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. You might notice here the densely packed pendant chords, encoding what seems to be a large amount of information efficiently for storage and transportation through the wrapping of the quipu in a bundle. Of course, the previous schematic sketch represents an idealized view of quipus, which most often are found as isolated strings in fragmentary condition, incomplete, or severely tangled, as you can see in some of the examples in the screen. Additionally, variability within the design of quipus, perhaps responding to local accounting needs or the creativity and skills of their makers, can also be appreciated. Although rare, there are examples, perhaps dating to the early colonial period, which structure do not correspond to the previous sketch. Instead, as you can see on the screen, these quipus have their pendants attached to an intricately carved wooden pole. In the case of this quipu, we can observe 3 individuals, with 2 of them sitting at the end of the pole holding a kero, a wooden drinking vessel. These figures might perhaps indicate the subject recorded in this quipu. They might indicate that the quipu was associated with the production of chicha, an alcoholic maize beer widely consumed in the Andes. In the case of the Fowler quipu, we can easily identify a thicker chord at the top, which is the main chord. From it, 16 base pendant chords hang, each of which includes approximately 3 subsidiary chords attached. Here you can see a detailed view of these pendant and subsidiary chords. The subsidiary strings exhibit a range of colors, which correspond to either dyed cotton, as it might be the case of this greenish bluish string, or the natural hues found in native Peruvian cotton. Additionally, if the Fowler quipu is complete and the knot at the end is original, this would be the end knot, indicating the end of the register. Quipus would have been made, kept, and read by the quipu camayos, the knot specialists, imperial administrators who supported the government in their role as official record keepers. Some of them would be responsible for the accounting of storehouses known as colcas, which you can see in the middle image on the screen, where items like fine textiles, ceramics, and foodstuff were kept for redistribution. Others could be responsible for updating the census at the level of the community or the province, and similarly for recording the payment of labor taxes. Drawings from the indigenous writer Felipe Huamampoma de Ayala, dating to the early 17th century, depict quipu camayos labeled as contador mayor and tesorero, chief accountant and treasurer. He showcases one of them reading from quipus in front of imperial storehouses for an Inca ruler, identifiable by his headdress, known as mascaipacha, and ear spools. Additionally, Huamampoma also depicts how quipus traveled through the empire at the hand of Inca messengers known as chasti. It is worth noting that in this illustration, Huamampoma labels the quipu as carta, or letter, perhaps indicating the function of this particular quipu or in an attempt to make the general function of quipus understandable for the manuscript's European audience. According to written documents from the colonial period by European and indigenous authors, quipus recorded numerical information associated with taxes and inventories, but also imperial genealogies, historical events, poetry, laws, and messages. Approximately a third of the surviving quipus that exist today exhibit notes which organization differ from the observed in numerical quipus, presumably indicating that they are of a narrative nature. While some chroniclers argued that the quipus were a device analogous to a written document of ours, which could be read by anyone who understood the system, Others expressed that quipus did not serve as text, as understandable by themselves, but instead function as mnemonic devices, which assisted in the remembrance of memorized information. Of course, we should have in mind that there is the possibility that there was not a single empire-wide recording system, but that different quipus follow different coding methods according to different purposes. Therefore, there might have been quipus analogous to written documents, and there might have also been quipus that function as mnemonic aids. Since the early 20th century, scholars working from a wide range of disciplines, including anthropology, archaeology, history, linguistics, textile studies, and mathematics, have been trying to decipher the quipu. Today, there is agreement that the notes seen in quipus encode numerical and non-numerical data. Further information might be encoded in the selection of material used, vegetal, cotton fibers, or camelid fibers. There might also be information encoded in the direction and number of knots, and the direction of the attachment of pendants from the main core, whether in its obverse side or its reverse side. Additionally, colors might represent the nature of the subject recorded in the quipu, and the spin and ply direction of the threads might provide also additional details. Spinning, for those who might not be familiar with textile terminology, is the technique by which fibers are transformed into single yarns. This is done either by hand or with the help of spindle whorls. Plying is the process of twisting two or more threads to make a stronger one. When two yarns are twisted together towards the right, we say they are S-plied. You can see an image of this in the screen. As the threads appear to cross each other, following the same direction as the middle section of the letter S. When they are twisted, turning towards the left, we say that they are C-ply. Based on interviews with modern quipu users, some scholars have proposed that the direction of the ply in Inka Khipu indicates the quality of the item accounted for, with the ply direction in S being the highest value, and that in the C direction being of lower quality. In the case of the example at the Fowler Museum, we can see that the majority of the strings, if not all, are S-plied, which we might interpret as accounting for goods highly valued. Accounting quipus are generally speaking available in one of three possible pendant colored patterns. Monochrome, as is the case of the British Museum quipu that you can see on the screen. Color banded, where various pendants dyed in one color are followed by various pendants dyed in a different color, like the ones seen to the right of the screen, or seriated, where a sequence of colors is repeated across the span of the quipu. It has been argued that color-banded quipus contain local level information, where each color might represent, for example, the labor contributions of an individual, of a specific individual within a community. A modern 20th century example of this kind of quipu has been studied by anthropologist Sabine Hyland at the town of Santiago de Antucaya. On the other hand, banded quipus have been argued to encode, seriated quipus, have been argued to encode aggregated information at a regional or state level, bringing together various local level quipus. Given the repetition of strings in beige, brown, dark brown, and greenish colors, it seems that the Fowler quipu corresponds the closest to the seriated quipu type. Of course, in order to be completely certain, we would have to work with the quipu to lay out all the strings in an organized manner, and having in mind the possibility that some of the strings might now have been lost. Within numerical quipus, so far, we are able to read the numbers represented in the notes. However, most often than not, what these numbers account for is unknown. In 1906, Ricardo Palma concluded that numerical quipus employed a decimal place system with notes arranged in various registers. The row at the bottom then corresponds to the units, the row above to the tens. Notes in the third register from the bottom refer to the hundreds, and so on. For single digits, a figure 8 note can be interpreted as a value of 1, whereas longer notes with 2 to 9 twists around the chord signify values ranging from 2 to 9. To represent higher values in a decimal system, quipus include single overhand notes, which value can be discerned given its placement along the chord. 2 overhand notes in the tens, then, would account for 20, but 2 overhand notes in the hundreds register would account for 200. Finally, an empty space symbolizes 0. In the example on the screen, the string to the left has a long note at the bottom with 5 twists. Here you can see a detail of it, corresponding to the number 5. Above, there is a blank space, which is worth 0. And in the hundreds register, there is a double note, which accounts for 200. Finally, at the very top, there is a single note worth 1,000. In the Fowler Khipu, we can see both long notes with 4 twists accounting for 4 units, as well as single and double notes that, depending on the placement on the cord, as we saw earlier, might be worth tens, hundreds, or thousands. What the Fowler Khipu accounts for is unknown, and unfortunately, most likely will never be known, since we don't know where it was found. The lack of archaeological context, which tell us whether a Khipu was found, for example, in a storehouse or a temple, has proven an obstacle when trying to better understand the meaning and dating of Khipus. Following the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire in 1532, Khipus continued to be actively used during the colonial and republican periods in a similar manner to how it had been done before. The Spanish conquest didn't signify the end of Khipus. During the 16th and 17th century, Andean witnesses read from Khipus when testifying during court cases. Khipus actually were used by the church to encourage catechesis, confession, and prayers. Khipus also continue to be used in the counting of census records, crop and livestock production. Interestingly, during the colonial period, items such as beans, charcoal, paper, or freeze-dried potatoes, as seen on the screen, began to be attached to Khipus, perhaps indicating the subject matter of said Khipu. Finally, Khipus were also used as letters during the 18th century, facilitating indigenous revolts. Some of the ethnographic Khipus, which communities have kept to this day, have a heritage value, but unfortunately can no longer be read. This is the case of the Coyata Khipus, studied by anthropologist Sabine Hyland. This pair of Khipus were stored by the community together with manuscripts written by local leaders dating to the 17th century. The Khipus in question date to the 18th century and constitute messages between local leaders associated with the 1783 Indigenous Rebellion. The reliance on Khipus, rather than on written documents, ensures secrecy from colonial authorities during these communication exchanges during the organization of said rebellion. The Coyata Khipus, as you can see on the screen, are much more complex than the ones we have discussed earlier. They lack a color sequence and exhibit great variety of color and fiber use, including fibers from vicuñas, deer, alpaca, llamas, guanacos, and vizcacha. Hyland suggests that some pendants within this narrative Khipus encode phonetic and ideographic values. The combination of color, type of fiber, and direction of ply might represent different syllables. Additionally, certain elements might represent entire concepts by themselves. For example, the brass of red deer hair at the beginning of one of the Khipus, which you can see to the right of the screen, it is thought to indicate that the subject discussed in said Khipu was about war associated with the Inca rulers. Khipu boards were developed by the Mercedarian order in the 16th century to record observances individuals were obliged to make during special ceremonies, as well as attendance to services. These devices combine written text on a paper covering a wooden tablet, to which noted strings were attached. Each string is at the same time associated with the name of a member in the community. According to Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello, who researched Khipu boards from the town of Casta, associated with the annual water ritual celebrated in the town, the strings recorded the objects necessary for the ritual that each individual had provided. Additionally, the string also recorded the task that each individual had completed, as well as an assessment of how well the task had been completed. If an individual had completed their obligations, the cord was pulled tightly to the board, only so in the end knot. On the other hand, if the task had not been completed, the string was left hanging loosely, making visible that the person had not completed the work. The Codex Martínez Compañón was created in the late 18th century by Baltasar Jaime Martínez Compañón, Bishop of Trujillo, and it includes over 1,400 watercolors, 2 of which depict items that seem to be Khipu boards. In the image on the left, a priest can be seen holding what seems to be a Khipu board with the strings lying on the ground before him. In this same image, an individual is depicted being punished through whipping, perhaps as a result of not having completed his tasks. On the right, an individual seems to be going through a board with 2 rows of names written on it, accompanied by red dots, which might indicate or might represent the end note of the strings indicated that those individuals had completed their assigned tasks. The Andean tradition of making funerary quipus to accompany the dead in their journey to the afterlife has seen a revival during the COVID-19 pandemic. Although the exact time when this practice originated is unknown, it is well recorded within the town of Cuspan, where simple quipus are made using a single 6-meter long cord made by plying together black and white yarns. It is worth noting that the yarns used in funerary quipus are to be brought by the relatives of the deceased, creating a connection between the living and the dead. In the Cuspan funerary quipus, only 7 knots are made. These represent each of them, which represents the Hail Mary prayer, one Hail Mary prayer. The quipu culminates in a cross representing the Our Father oration. Funerary quipus in this town are thus a reinterpretation of ancient Andean quipus, bringing together indigenous and Christian beliefs and practices. When complete, the funerary quipu is wrapped around the waist of the individual with the strings left lying above the legs of the deceased and interred with the body. Quipus remain a source of inspiration for contemporary artists. Perhaps the best known example of modern artistic reinterpretations of ancient quipus can be found in the work of New York-based Chilean artist Cecilia Vicuña. Vicuña has created monumental quipus like the ones seen on the screen, which function as immersive and participatory installation. Often they are paired in museums with ancient quipus. This pairing between the ancient Andean quipus and Vicuña's work reminds us of the continued life of quipus from ancient to modern times, even if transformed or reinterpreted. Outside of the textile medium, Peruvian artist Elena Izque illustrated a quipu in 1921 as part of her goal to compile an inventory of ancient Andean motifs to be used within the tourist industry, but as well in schools and by industrial engineers and fashion designers. More recently, Patricia Academy, a Colombian artist and researcher, currently an artist in residence at the UCLA Artsy Center, has incorporated the quipu, in her case an electronic quipu, in her multimedia performance, Knotting Memory, in which the act of knotting of conductive rubber string sensors generates music. The act of knotting itself creates music. I hope this introductory talk has sparked your interest in ancient and contemporary quipus. If you want to keep exploring this topic, I recommend the following resources. Thanks for listening.
Alba, this is so fascinating. We don't have a lot of time left, so let's jump right into the Q&A. Janice asks, were these used primarily in Peru, or were they used in other countries like Ecuador?
Yeah, definitely. So because they were used in the Inca Empire, and the Inca Empire spanned several countries, several modern countries across the Andes, they were used also in places like Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina. So yes, they go beyond Peru.
We have so many. Lena asks, were different types of knots used? If so, what would that represent? We sort of spoke about that. And did the length of the pendant subsidiary cords matter? And why were they not always made in uniform lengths?
That's a great question. And definitely we know that there are at least 2 types of knots and that they indicate some numerical values. But as you can see in some of the examples I have provided, whether ancient or more modern, there is a lot of variability. Not all the quipus respond to this ideal sketch or ideal scheme. Unfortunately, what these variations mean is not yet known. Whether the length of the cords could have meaning, it is an interesting option, of course, and should be further studied. As I said earlier, unfortunately, a lot of the quipus that exist in private and museum collections today lack their archaeological context, so we don't know where they were found. And without that, a huge piece of information is missing.
Tag on about the colors. Perry asks, are there any quipus for which the color symbolism is known?
So I know that there are some discussions of red color being associated with the Inca, whether the lead or war, as in the case of the 18th century ones. There are some speculations of the meaning of colors, but again, unfortunately, not clear answer. I know that, for example, in the case of funerary quipus, where we can actually, or as scholars can actually talk with modern funerary quipu makers, the color of these two strings used, the black or dark blue in some cases and white, do have a symbolism, with the black being associated with death and the white being associated with life. So in this case, yes, there is symbolism in the color selection, and we do know what they mean.
Awesome. Janice asks, were the quipus used over and over again, or were new ones made for each communication?
Yes, that's the interesting thing. Whereas a written document, right, you write something and it's like forever there if you write it with ink or in paper. Quipus do allow the unknotting and knotting of new knots. So it's a flexible system, and yes, they could be reused. We know that some more recent ones, like the case of the quipu boards, certain knots are made and then remade whenever new ceremonies are needed or new items are needed for additional ceremonies. So they do allow this flexibility, and they are not to be discarded. They are not one use only.
Zen asks, I've read some quipus have been found made with human hair. Have you come across any of these in your studies?
Wow, no, I did not know that. That's really interesting. And I wonder what it means, of course. Hair does have a lot of symbolism, especially if it was associated with the Inca rulers. Their hair, whenever it was cut, it was to be kept and not discarded or left in anyone's hands. So that could be important. But yes, again, cotton and camelid fiber is the most spread material, but there are these interesting, then odd cases that clearly, if someone has included human hair, means that that was a deliberate act with some symbolism behind.
Louise asks, when and why did Inka Inca become Inka Inka?
That's a great question. So, of course, Quechua, as I said before, was not written during the Inca Empire. It only started to get written down by the hand of Spanish authors or indigenous authors during the colonial period, who used a more Spanish spelling just because that's what they knew, right? With ideas of indigenous language revival and an attempt to create a more Quechua spelling that doesn't depend on Spanish writing systems, there has been this transformation to acquire this own Quechua spelling. There is some disagreements about it, and there is still a lot of variability with certain, as Quechua is also spread beyond Peru with other dialects existing in other regions. There are different spellings that can be found, which complicates a little bit literature, working with literature or scholarly literature, because a single word can be spelled in so many different ways.
Thank you. A few more questions. Elbatzel asks, is there any research being done regarding a possible relationship between quipus and Romanian string skirts?
Not that I'm aware of. I didn't know about this other Romanian practice. I mean, I don't know if anything would come out of it, but what it truly shows is that there are different ways of recording information. Even though we have always spoken of these societies or these cultures that didn't have writing, they have found different ways to basically get the same end result, which is just communication exchanges and recording of information. But it's interesting to see that there are some cross-cultural comparisons to be made.
Let's do one more from Julia. Thank you for this great talk. She says, do we know or assume that some quipus record calendrical or astronomical information?
Yes, there are some discussions of quipus with specific sequences of knots that get repeated and specific colors that get repeated over and over and over, which could indicate that there is a calendar. Of course, we do know from ethnohistoric documents that, as I said before, that these quipus are not just about numbers. It's not just about counting things. They have deeper meaning in some cases, and calendrical information definitely could be part of it, as well as religious ceremonies that might have been associated with those calendars.
Okay, I think that is all the time we have. Thank you so much, Alba, for illuminating the art of quipus for us. We're always so pleased to highlight the work being done by students at UCLA, and it's even more special to have one of our own Fowler Student Council members sharing their knowledge with us today. Thank you to everyone who joined us. This program has been recorded and will be available immediately on our Facebook page, and in a few days, it will be uploaded to our Instagram and the Fowler website for you to revisit and share. We hope you'll join us again for our next program. Details can be found on the closing slide. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you, Alba.